A fire sparked at noon, but no match was struck. Welcome to Poirot Papers. I am your host, Wickham. I'm always amazed by who's listening. Drop a comment and share your corner of the world. Your messages make every story come alive. Let's begin. It is the peculiar privilege of the English countryside to wrap itself in the sort of quiet that suggests nothing ever happens, except for the things that most assuredly have. Thus it was with Blackthorpe Hollow, a small Wiltshire village occupied chiefly by ancient hedgerows, vicarage gossip, and the eternal resentment between the local Women's Institute and the Church Flower Committee. These were not matters to provoke murder, except perhaps in the abstract. It was St. Mildred's Day, a brisk Thursday in October, when Miss Cordelia Blount-Simons, spinster, horticulturalist, and quite possibly the only person west of Oxford to collect Meissen teapots with apostolic zeal, discovered her houseguest in a state of inconvenient expiration beside the fireplace. The guest in question, one Mr. Eustace Fenlow, was a scholar of minor Edwardian poets, and, if whispers over the churchyard wall were to be credited, a man not entirely at peace with his tax obligations. He had come down from London to assist Miss Blount-Simons in cataloguing her late uncle's library, a task that had taken, she noted with curious emphasis, precisely 27 hours, during which Mr. Fenlow consumed 3 tins of anchovy, paced, borrowed a pair of reading spectacles, and, according to Cook, took too long by half in the upstairs bath. It was Miss Blount-Simons who raised the alarm at exactly 12:17 p.m., having noted the peculiar circumstance that the drawing-room fireplace had lit itself. "Lit itself, Inspector," she repeated with the air of someone accustomed to being believed about remarkable occurrences. "I never touch it before 5. The kindling box is in the cellar, and the flue hasn't drawn properly since 1938. And yet, there it was, flame, dancing about as though invited. Constable Tipple, a stout and good-natured man whose chief occupation was refereeing parish cricket disputes, found the whole business rummy. He was further perturbed by Mr. Fenlow's posture, reclined, chin dropped, hand resting on a volume of the poems of Lionel Strongarm, and face decidedly scorched. It was, as the later coroner would confirm, not the fireplace that had lit the man, but the other way round. When Inspector Parker arrived, called in from London by an increasingly flustered chief constable who had once mislaid a murder in Devizes, he was greeted with the traditional local reticence, a plate of crumbling shortbread, and an opinionated parrot that shouted, "Liar!" whenever anyone mentioned Eustace Fenlow's name. It was Lord Peter Wimsey, of course, who arrived last, not by design, but by artifice, having paused en route to discuss ecclesiastical embroidery with the curate's wife. "Well, Parker," Wimsey murmured after surveying the drawing-room with the air of a man confronted by an unsatisfactory cheese-board, "either our victim suffered a spontaneous combustion more precise than a Swiss timepiece, or someone went to extraordinary trouble to make this appear like a literary accident. Do you notice the clock?" Parker frowned. "It says 12, rather punctual for a country house." "Indeed." Wimsey's monocle caught the light as he leaned forward. "Except the coroner puts time of death at 10:30, and Miss Blount-Simons swears the fire was unlit at 11. A fireplace that ignites at noon, an Edwardian poet with charred eyebrows, and a parrot with trust issues. What a deliciously inconvenient trinity. Let's begin." And so they did. Cook, whose real name was Mrs. Grindle, and who bore a resemblance to Queen Victoria had Her Majesty been habitually armed with a rolling pin, was summoned to the drawing-room with the gravity usually reserved for royal summons or wartime rationing announcements. She entered wiping her hands on a tea-towel and wearing the slightly martyred expression of one who has had her baking schedule interrupted by death. "No, my lord," she said in answer to Lord Peter Wimsey's first question. "I did not see Mr. Fenlo this morning, not properly. He took his breakfast on a tray in the library again, like yesterday. Said he was in the middle of a poetic fugue, whatever that is. I don't ask questions about those things." "Quite right," said Wimsey gravely. "I've known fugues to persist for days, usually in G minor. And the breakfast? Half a kipper, lukewarm tea, and a slice of toast, barely touched. It all came back down on the tray, except the butter, which he always said tasted of church candles." "An ecclesiastical palate," murmured Wimsey. "And what time was the tray taken up?" "Just before 9. Elsie, she's the maid, took it. I saw her carry it up myself. And the fire in the drawing-room, lit by you, Mrs. Grindle's eyebrows threatened to defect from her face entirely." "Certainly not. I've enough to do without lighting fires in rooms nobody's sitting in. And Miss Cordelia's quite strict about it. Says it gives the wrong idea to have a drawing-room warm before tea. No, sir. That fire was as cold as charity when I went past at 10:30 with the sheets." 10:30, Wimsey echoed thoughtfully, glancing at Parker. "And the coroner estimates time of death at around the same hour." Parker nodded, scribbling. Wimsey knelt by the fireplace again. "Do you smell that, Charles?" Parker sniffed. "Charcoal and something sweeter. Paraffin wax," Wimsey said. "Somebody lit this rather decisively. And recently." He turned to Mrs. Grindle, who now looked disapproving enough to curdle milk. "Would you be so kind as to send up Elsie? We're very interested in the state of Mr. Fenlo's breakfast tray." Elsie turned out to be a wisp of a girl, with the demeanour of someone constantly apologising for her own shadow. She had an anxious habit of smoothing her apron every time a question was asked, and her voice was barely audible over the tick of the long-case clock in the hallway. "I took it up at 9, sir, like Mrs. Grindle said." He was already in the library, writing in one of them notebooks. Wimsey arched an eyebrow. "And did he speak to you?" "He said thank you. That was all. Didn't even look up proper. Did he seem well?" Elsie hesitated. "He seemed quiet, but he were always like that. Spoke soft, like he didn't want to disturb the dust. But yesterday I saw him jump when the front bell rang." "Indeed? And who was at the door?" "No one, sir. Least not when I got there. I looked about, but there weren't anyone on the path. I thought maybe it was the bell pulling itself again. It sticks when the wind's high. A self-ringing bell and a self-lighting fire," murmured Wimsey. "Either the household spirits are active, or someone else's. You didn't see anyone walking away. No figures down the lane." She shook her head. "Only Mrs. Tipton, and she was coming from the grocer's, not the gate." Wimsey rose. "And when did you last see Mr. Fenlo alive?" She wrung her hands. 10:30, I think. I was dusting the hallway outside the drawing-room. I heard him cough." "Inside?" "No, sir. Walking in. The library door shut after that. I thought he'd gone in there again. But the body was found in the drawing room. Yes, sir, that's what's odd. Wimsey said nothing for a moment. Then, with a peculiar smile, Elsie, you've been remarkably clear. One last thing. When you dusted the hall, were the curtains drawn? Curtains? Oh, you mean the heavy ones by the drawing-room arch? They're always left open. Miss Cordelia likes the light. Wimsey's smile deepened. So do murderers. Thank you, Elsie. Once the girl had departed, Parker turned to Wimsey. So the man was alive at 10:30, last seen entering the library. But then, somehow, ends up dead in the drawing-room by noon, the fireplace roaring like Guy Fawkes' Day. Assuming, said Wimsey, that he died at 10:30 and not later. The coroner's estimate isn't exact. What interests me is the fire. He crouched before it again, using a folded handkerchief to lift the poker. Look here. Charred at the tip, but the base is cold, not recently held. This fire was built up all at once and very quickly. No gradual burning. That suggests haste. Parker crouched beside him. And the body? Face burned, but otherwise no sign of a struggle. Precisely. Which suggests he was already unconscious, or dead, when the fire was lit. Parker frowned. Could someone have moved the body after killing him elsewhere? That depends on whether Mr. Fenlow had a habit of combusting when unattended, but there's another oddity. He stepped over to the writing desk beside the window. A notebook lay open, the pen still uncapped beside it. The handwriting, tight and left-slanted, covered only 3 lines on the page. Wimsey read aloud. The bell tolled once, but no one came. The fire does not burn unless watched. Even in silence, the house listens. Parker made a face. More poetry, or prophecy. Wimsey tapped the pen. Fresh ink, written this morning. I'd wager very shortly before he died. You think it means something. I think Mr. Fenlow saw something, or knew something, and someone was very keen he never told it. The question is, what was he doing in the drawing-room at all? If he was found there but last seen walking into the library? Parker's eyes narrowed. Then either someone moved him, or the person in the drawing-room wasn't him. Wimsey's smile sharpened. Very good. And now, let's have a look at the garden. They stepped through the French doors. The grass outside still wet with dew. The back of the house offered a quiet view of trees, a bench, and, curiously, a battered gardener's shed with a smoking chimney. Wimsey paused. Parker, do you know what's peculiar about the shed? Other than the fact that it's warm? No. Gardener in residence. Inside, they found a small, recently extinguished stove, a coat hanging on a peg, and a pair of muddy boots. On the table lay a copy of the Times, a mostly eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and most strikingly, a monocular field glass. Wimsey picked it up. Our missing gardener has been bird-watching, or perhaps man-watching. From here you'd have a perfect view of the drawing-room window and the library entrance. Parker lifted the sandwich. Still soft. Someone's been here this morning. Then let us find our man, or rather, find out why he vanished. Back in the house, Miss Blount-Simons awaited them with the strained dignity of someone attempting to maintain household order while one's guest remains stubbornly dead in the next room. I do hope, she said, this won't reflect poorly on my book club. Wimsey bowed. On the contrary, madam, I suspect it will make your meetings uncommonly well attended. Tell me, might we speak to your late uncle's solicitor? I understand the will was quite specific." Her gaze sharpened. "Very. Eustace said he'd found something of interest among the papers. Said it was to be kept secret. He wouldn't say what. I assumed it was something tedious about Latin verbs." Wimsey nodded slowly. "That may be, but if so, someone was willing to kill over conjugation. I do hope he didn't burn the evidence." And Parker cleared his throat. A knock echoed from the front door. A telegram had arrived. Miss Blount-Simons opened it, read it, paled slightly, and handed it silently to Wimsey. It read, "Stop poking at ashes. Some things burn better than others. S." Wimsey read it twice, handed it back with a faint smile, and turned to Parker. "Well," he said, "that's unusually direct for English countryside threats. Someone wants us out of the fireplace. Charles, I think we ought to stay in it." It was not until after luncheon, an affair in which Miss Blount-Simons insisted upon serving cold beef and horseradish in the style my uncle preferred, murder notwithstanding, that Lord Peter and Inspector Parker were finally able to extract themselves from the lingering aroma of pickled walnuts and reconvene in the library. Wimsey had eaten little, though he had praised the mustard with sufficient extravagance to leave Miss Blount-Simons both flattered and faintly suspicious. He now lounged in the leather armchair opposite the hearth, long legs stretched toward a stack of books, monocle glinting like a half-lidded eye of judgment. "I say, Charles," he remarked, "have you ever known a man so thoroughly charred who still managed to be such a cipher?" Parker, who was attempting to cross-reference Fenlow's publications with the list of Miss Blount-Simons's uncle's known associates, made a non-committal grunt. Fenlow was quiet, reclusive, and didn't pay his taxes. That covers a considerable swath of the academic community. But not all of them are the subject of cryptic threats involving combustion. He rose, moving toward the bookshelves with the air of one indulging in idle perusal, though Parker knew him too well to believe it accidental. Wimsey's fingers skimmed the spines of volumes, Byron, Swinburne, Rossetti, before pausing at a thinner cloth-bound journal wedged between poems of the minor Anglican revival and the unexpurgated letters of Algernon Reith. He drew it out. "Hallo, Fenlow's handwriting. Neat little devil. Look here." Parker stood to peer over Wimsey's shoulder as he flipped through the pages. The entries were irregular, written in spurts across several months, though recent pages had been filled with a new urgency. One entry, dated just 4 days prior, was underlined in red. "She said the clause would ruin everything. I asked if he had ever mentioned the chapel. She turned pale. Later, I saw her speaking to someone near the Folly. Must remember to ask about the gardener." Another entry, dated 2 days before the murder, read, "There is something in the hearth. Tap the stones. Hollow. May need to pry loose bricks. Dangerous. Better wait until she's out." Parker looked up. The chapel. The Folly. Sounds like the grounds deserve a more thorough walk. Indeed, and our elusive gardener becomes ever more tantalizing. Wimsey closed the journal with a satisfied snap. "Now, what say we go poke about the architectural eccentricities of this estate before someone posts another ominous telegram?" They set out once again into the garden, the air sharp with the promise of rain. The folly in question, a grotesque Victorian construction meant, no doubt, to suggest the ruins of an imagined abbey, stood at the far edge of the Blount Simons property, just past the yew hedge. It had long since succumbed to moss, ivy, and a pleasing air of irrelevance. Wimsey ran a hand along one of the lichen-covered stones. If I were the sort of man inclined to reveal secrets, Charles, this is where I'd do it. Somewhere no one has visited since Queen Victoria's last bowel. Movement. Parker, less poetic, inspected the ground. Footprints. Recent? Very. And 2 sets. One booted, standard gardener's tread, I'd say. The other heeled. Wimsey gave a low whistle. Ladies in follies, the stuff of poetry, or blackmail. He moved to the low-arched doorway that led into the crumbling central chamber. There, tucked behind a pile of broken flagstones, lay a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. Parker retrieved it carefully, unwrapping the damp cloth to reveal a set of documents, yellowed and folded. Wimsey scanned them rapidly. Legal deeds, and this, a revised will, dated only a fortnight ago. It names one Miss Cordelia Blount Simons as the primary beneficiary, unless, and here it is, should the estate's historical chapelry be sold or deconsecrated, said inheritance shall pass to Eustace Fenlow, or his legal representatives. Parker looked up sharply. So she stood to lose everything if the chapel was sold. Precisely. And as we've established, the late Mr. Fenlow had discovered something within that chapel, or possibly the drawing-room fireplace, that he believed was relevant. Wimsey tapped the document. The will was never registered. This is an unsigned copy. But if Fenlow had the original, or even knowledge of it, he'd represent a very awkward obstacle to Miss Blount Simons's retirement plans. They returned to the house in a silence heavy with implication. Parker went to telephone the solicitor, while Wimsey, with feline deliberation, wandered back into the drawing-room. The fire had long since died out, and the scent of scorched wool lingered like the ghost of some unfortunate valet. He stood by the fireplace considering. Fenlow had suspected something inside, had attempted to investigate, had written cryptically of tapping bricks. Wimsey crouched and began gently rapping along the rear wall of the hearth with the handle of his cane. The sound was solid, hollow. He leaned in, eyes narrowing. Brick, slightly darker than the rest, gave a faint click when pressed on one edge. With a twist and a tug, it slid out, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside, wrapped in oil paper, was a single object, a small, ivory-handled dagger. The blade was stained, not with ash, with blood. Wimsey held it up to the light. "Well, well," he murmured. Someone played a very old-fashioned trick. He turned as Parker re-entered. "Charles, the solicitor confirms the revision was drafted, but not filed." He hadn't heard from Fenlow since. Presumed he'd abandoned the claim. "On the contrary," Wimsey said, "he appears to have pursued it to the bitter end." He handed over the dagger. "Found in the fireplace cavity Fenlow was investigating. Blood-stained. My theory?" Fenlow discovered the will's implications and confronted the relevant party. Was stabbed, perhaps here, perhaps elsewhere, and his body staged beside the fire to obscure the wound with burn. Then the fire lit to hide the scent, distort the timeline, and add a whisper of theatricality. Parker was studying the blade. "You think Miss Blount-Simons? I think she had means, motive, and opportunity. But she may not have acted alone. She was seen speaking to someone near the folly. The gardener has vanished, and there's still the matter of the parrot." "The parrot?" Wimsey's smile was wicked. "It repeats the word liar when Fenlow's name is mentioned, and birds only repeat what they hear. I think our parrot may have heard more than the household knows." At that moment the drawing-room door opened. Miss Blount-Simons stood there, pale, eyes blazing. "I must ask you, Lord Peter," she said, "to stop this line of questioning. I cannot abide having my household interrogated like common criminals." Wimsey turned slowly. "Miss Blount-Simons, you may wish to withdraw for a while. There are things in this house older than you, and secrets that burn far more deeply than logs in a fire." She did not respond, only turned and swept out, leaving the faint smell of lavender and ice behind her. Wimsey turned back to Parker. "We'll need the gardener, Charles, before nightfall." And somewhere in the distance, muffled but unmistakable, the parrot's voice floated through the hall. "Liar, liar, liar." The gardener, when finally unearthed from the station in Marlborough, where he had been loitering with a pint and a newspaper that he appeared to be reading upside down, turned out to be one Mr. Ralph Everley, a man of singularly sallow complexion, and the narrow-eyed, evasive countenance of a habitual back-gate user. He was brought back to Blackthorpe Hollow, not under arrest, but with sufficient suggestion of consequence to ensure that his reluctance to speak was tempered by a distinct twitch in his upper lip every time Parker so much as shifted his weight. Wimsey met him not in the drawing-room, which still bore the olfactory ghost of Fenlow's demise, but in the study, where the air was clearer and the ambiance slightly less accusatory. Everley sat opposite him, hat clutched in hand, boots shedding mud onto the rug, with what could have been either insolence or obliviousness. "I'd like," said Lord Peter, in the gentle tones of someone about to ask a child to confess to smashing, "the Wedgwood, to understand why a man in steady employ, with a roof over his head and presumably a reasonably reliable stew-pot, takes it into his head to abscond the very morning a corpse appears in the drawing-room fireplace." Everley squirmed. "Didn't know nothing about a corpse, sir. I'd been told I were no longer needed." "By whom?" There was a beat of hesitation. "Miss Blount-Simons." Parker made a low sound of satisfaction. Wimsey held up a hand. "And she gave you notice on—" "Tuesday evening, sir. Said as how there weren't no more use for me this week. Grounds all tidy, and the boarders dying off. Gave me my wages, and said I might go visit my sister." "Very thoughtful," Wimsey murmured. "And did you?" "No, sir. Went into town, instead, to avoid being questioned." The gardener stared. "No! Just didn't want trouble. I'd heard things, you see, from the others, about the guest, Mr. Fenlow." Wimsey leaned forward slightly. "What sort of things?" Everley glanced toward Parker, then down at his boots. "He was asking a lot about the old chapel. Said he wanted to walk the property for historic value. I caught him once, trying to pry open the door. It's been locked since Miss Cordelia's uncle passed. Did he go inside?" "Not that I saw, sir, but he talked like he'd seen something. Asked me if anyone else came up that way often. I told him no, but truth is, I'd seen someone few days back, evening time." "Describe them," Couldn't, sir. Wore a cloak. Real old-fashioned thing. Hood up. Thought it was Miss Cordelia at first, tall and thin-like. But when they turned, the light hit just right, and I reckon it were a man. Parker straightened. Could it have been Fenlow? No, sir. He was down in the library at that time. I'd just taken him a note Miss Cordelia sent, about supper arrangements, and he'd said no to soup. Wimsey made a thoughtful sound. You seem to have paid close attention to his dining preferences. Man had allergies, said Everly defensively. Didn't like root veg. Tell me, Mr. Everly, Wimsey continued, did you ever see anyone else speaking with Miss Blount-Simons in the garden? Perhaps near the Folly? The gardener fidgeted again. She met someone there Tuesday morning. I saw her from the shed window. They were arguing. Could you hear what was said? No, sir. But he had his hands clenched tight, like he was trying not to shout. Then he pointed toward the house and left quick. Didn't see where he went after that. Could it have been Fenlow? I don't think so. This fellow walked different, more like a soldier or something. Parker turned to Wimsey. That still doesn't explain the missing hours between 10:30 and noon. Or the fire. Wimsey rose and moved toward the window. Outside, rain had begun to stipple the garden paths. He watched it fall, abstracted. Mr. Everly, he said suddenly, do you know what an ash straw is? The gardener blinked. Course, sir. Every fire grate's got one. Quite. And do you happen to know whether Miss Blount-Simons's drawing-room fireplace has had its ash removed recently? Everly squinted. I emptied it last Friday. Not since. No, sir. Then someone must have done so this morning, or yesterday. Because when we arrived, it was curiously clean. Nothing but fresh coals. Wimsey turned back. Eyes narrowed. Someone went to great lengths to remove all evidence of what had previously burned in that fireplace. Everly swallowed audibly. I think, Wimsey continued softly, we ought to speak to Miss Blount-Simons again. She may find it difficult, but I dare say she remembers Tuesday morning's visitor rather more vividly than she lets on. Miss Blount-Simons did not respond well to being questioned a second time. She stood by the mantelpiece in the study, ramrod straight, the high collar of her morning blouse bristling like a barricade. I've said everything I know, she stated. I gave Mr. Fenlow access to my uncle's library. I do not believe it is a crime to be generous to guests. Certainly not, said Wimsey affably, though what he found there may have been rather less generous to you. Her jaw tightened. If you are referring to that will, I am. It was never filed. It has no legal standing. True, but it did give Mr. Fenlow motive, and someone else reason to fear his persistence. She turned slowly toward him. Do you honestly believe I am capable of murder, Lord Peter? I have believed, he replied, that a woman was capable of murder over a misplaced linen tablecloth. I try not to let capacity distract me from motive. She laughed sharp as glass. I did not kill him. Then who did? Her expression shifted subtly. Something behind the eyes, a flicker of fear, or perhaps guilt, rubbed raw from concealment. I don't know, she said, but someone you suspected? She didn't answer. Miss Blount-Simons, Wimsey continued gently, you told Fenlow about the clause. He confronted you. He pressed for access to the chapel. Perhaps you refused, perhaps not. Either way, someone else overheard, or was told, and that person wanted very much for Fenlo to stop digging. She stared at him. "You speak in riddles." "Poets do. Detectives merely quote them." He stepped forward, voice softening. "I don't think you lit the fire, but I think you know who did." Her hand trembled slightly on the mantel. She faltered. "I saw him. That morning, in the hall, just before 10. He said he'd been walking the grounds, but his boots were wet. And they were covered in ash." Wimsey's voice was barely above a whisper. "Who?" She closed her eyes. "The Reverend Lyle." There was a pause. Parker looked up sharply. "The vicar?" She nodded. "He was close with my uncle. Helped draft the new will. I think Eustace may have gone to him for help, or threatened to reveal something buried in that chapel." Wimsey glanced at Parker. "Then it's time we paid a visit to the good Reverend." Outside, the rain had become steady. As they stepped into it, Wimsey turned up his collar and murmured, "A vicar, Charles, is like a fireplace, when properly attended, warm and agreeable, but left alone, one never quite knows what might smoulder in the ashes." The vicarage at Blackthorpe Hollow sat hunched behind a thicket of dripping yew, its narrow windows like half-lidded eyes peering out into the wet afternoon. The house was of the old kind, Victorian with Georgian pretensions and an unshakable dampness that clung to the wallpaper like a penitent. Inside, the carpets gave slightly underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of faded lilies and pipe tobacco. Reverend Osric Lyle greeted them with the mild surprise of a man unused to visitors and even less used to policemen. He was tall, stooped, and pale to the point of translucence, his white collar emerging stiffly from the folds of a black woolen cardigan. His hands, Wimsey noticed, were long and clean but ink-stained at the fingertips. "Lord Peter, Inspector Parker, a pleasure, though I confess I cannot imagine what brings you out in this weather, unless the church roof has finally surrendered to the will of the Almighty." "Alas, no such biblical theatrics," said Wimsey, removing his sodden hat and glancing about the sitting-room. "We've come on a matter more worldly, though the chapel does play a part." Lyle's expression shifted, just for a moment, but in that moment a muscle behind his jaw clenched visibly. Then he smiled with the soft, weary politeness peculiar to rural clergymen and undertakers. "I see. This must concern the death of Mr. Fenlo. Ah, you've heard." "Only what Miss Blount-Simons saw fit to tell me over the telephone. A dreadful thing. Poor man. I had not seen much of him lately, but he struck me as delicate." Wimsey nodded. "You knew him well?" "Not well. Casually. He consulted me occasionally on matters of local history. He was interested in the chapel. Most of the estate's records passed through my hands eventually. It's a crumbling relic now, but a curious one. He had a scholarly interest, or so I thought." "You helped draft Mr. Blount-Simons's revised will?" A flicker again. "Yes. He asked me to witness a draft. I made recommendations, if memory serves, about how best to protect the sanctity of the chapel. He was devoted to it, more devoted than his niece." Lyle hesitated. Cordelia is a practical woman. She values tradition, but not at the cost of efficiency. She had plans for that corner of the grounds. Her uncle did not share them. And Eustace Fenlow? I believe he was sympathetic to the elder Mr. Blount-Simons's intentions. There was talk of forming a preservation trust. I suspect Cordelia found the idea tiresome. Preservation can be so inconvenient, said Wimsey dryly. And you, Reverend, do you recall what you were doing on Thursday morning between 10 and noon? The vicar blinked. Reading, I believe. My parish duties on Thursdays are limited. I had no appointments. No visitors. A pause. Not until afternoon. No. Why? Because we've reason to believe Mr. Fenlow may have been here, or rather may have contacted you about the chapel, about the will, about the implications of what might happen should it be ignored. Lyle's brow furrowed. He did write to me, yes, a brief note. I received it Wednesday afternoon. He asked me to meet him, but I declined. I suspected it had to do with legal matters, and I'm no solicitor. Wimsey accepted this with a soft and turned toward the fireplace. This one, unlike Miss Blount-Simons's, was cold and smelled of soot, not wax. Did you burn the letter? Yes, it seemed unimportant. I see. Wimsey turned. And the chapel, do you keep the key? I do. May we see it? This request, delivered casually, had the effect of a stone in a pond. Lyle looked briefly alarmed, then composed himself. Certainly. It's in the desk. He opened a drawer and produced an ancient iron key on a tarnished ring. Wimsey took it, held it up, examined it, and slipped it into his pocket with unseemly familiarity. You don't mind, do you? We'll return it. Lyle smiled thinly. Not at all. Outside again, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Parker adjusted his collar and muttered, Well, do you believe him? I believe he'd rather be caught in the confessional with a bottle of gin than admit what he knows. You think he's protecting someone? I think he's hiding something. Whether that's knowledge, guilt, or both, we'll see. But first, let's have a look at the chapel. The chapel was older than the house. Its foundation sunk low and dark into the sodden soil. It leaned slightly, as though tired of its own piety. The heavy door gave way with a groan of rusted hinges, and Wimsey stepped inside with the reverence of a man entering an ancestral crypt. Dust swirled, disturbed by their intrusion, and the air smelled of mould, wax, and time. The interior was plain, stone pews, a narrow altar, and behind it a wooden panel carved with Latin inscriptions too faded to read. But what drew Wimsey's attention was not the altar, but the floor. Look here, Charles. Parker peered down. A section of flagstone near the front pews bore a hairline crack, and more than that, showed signs of recent disturbance. The mortar around the edges was pale and uneven. Wimsey crouched and ran his hand along the edge. Loosened, he murmured, deliberately, and recently. With Parker's help, he worked the stone up with a dull clatter. Beneath was a cavity, no more than 2 feet deep. And in it, wrapped in brown oilcloth, was a stack of ledgers and a small leather pouch. The pouch contained 2 items, an antique signet ring engraved with the Blount-Simons family crest, and a sheaf of what appeared to be handwritten letters. Wimsey opened one. Letters from the elder Mr. Blount-Simons, he murmured, addressed to Fenlow. Parker frowned. He was corresponding with the old man? Extensively, and not just about poetry. Listen, he read aloud. The chapel must be protected at all costs. If Cordelia refuses to listen, you must preserve the truth. I have hidden the original deed and the record of what occurred in 1889. You alone will understand the implications. I trust you. The rest will burn." Wimsey lowered the letter. Parker raised an eyebrow. What happened in 1889? Something that someone, Cordelia, Lyle, is willing to kill to keep buried. He opened one of the ledgers. Inside were crisp, inked records, donations, inventories, dates, and one entry circled in red. July 14th, 1889. Transfer of remains, unofficial. Witness O. Lyle Sr. Wimsey closed the book gently. And there it is. What is it? Evidence of some clandestine exhumation, perhaps, or relocation. Something the church and the family wanted forgotten, which Fenlo rediscovered. Parker exhaled, so they silenced him. Perhaps, but which they? Wimsey looked back toward the door, rain still spitting through the open crack. Let's return to the house. I believe it's time to reconstruct our timeline, minute by minute. Someone's alibi is about to unravel. By the time Lord Peter and Inspector Parker returned to the manor, the rain had faded to a fine mist, draping Blackthorpe Hollow in a soft gloom. It was the sort of weather that seemed to hush even the trees, leaving the landscape suspended, as if waiting to hear something whispered at the very edge of sound. Wimsey strode directly to the library, the discovery from the chapel tucked discreetly under his arm. Miss Blount-Simons was not in sight, though the scent of lavender and pipe smoke lingered faintly, as though the room had been recently abandoned. The fire here had been laid but not lit, its wood dry and perfectly arranged. Too perfect, Wimsey thought absently. Nothing in this house remained so orderly by accident. He turned to Parker. Let's begin. The timeline, as we understand it. Thursday morning. At 9 o'clock, Elsie delivers Mr. Fenlo's breakfast to the library. He is alive and writing, polite, distracted as poets are, yes? Parker nodded, consulting his notebook. At 9:15, cook confirmed she passed the drawing room. The fireplace was cold, the room empty. Elsie, meanwhile, sees Fenlo re-enter the library after fetching a book from the hall. Then, at 10:30, Wimsey continued, Elsie hears someone cough and the sound of a door closing, believing Fenlo has entered the library again. But he is later found in the drawing room, dead. And according to the coroner, Parker said, he died between 10 and 11, but his body was not discovered until afternoon, by which time the fire was blazing. Wimsey tapped the mantelpiece. The curious thing is this. Miss Blount-Simons claims the fire lit itself at precisely noon, but that is, of course, nonsense. She lied? No, Charles. She said what she saw. She entered the drawing room at noon, noticed the fire blazing, and the body slumped beside it. But what if the fire had been lit earlier, and she simply hadn't entered until then? Parker frowned. But the fire was too hot, too fresh to have been burning long. Unless, said Wimsey, someone carefully removed the original ash, restacked the grate with clean coals, and relit it just before her arrival. He crossed to the writing desk and retrieved Fenlo's notebook again. We assumed this last entry, the fire does not burn unless watched, was poetic metaphor. but perhaps it was literal. Parker glanced at the notes. So, the fire wasn't meant to be a cover-up. It was a signal. Exactly. Wimsey's eyes gleamed. A signal to someone, or a message to us. Either way, it tells us Fenlo knew he was in danger. He must have left the chapel the night before with the documents we found. Perhaps he confided in someone, perhaps not. But by morning, he was preparing to act, to confront someone, or perhaps to flee. Then he was intercepted. Wimsey nodded. Which brings us to the gardener, Mr. Everley. He says he saw Miss Blount Simons and an unknown figure, male, cloaked and familiar, with the grounds near the folly, and Everley himself was told, somewhat abruptly, to take leave that morning, to clear the estate of witnesses. Indeed. Meanwhile, the Reverend Lyle tells us he received a note from Fenlo requesting a meeting. He burned it, claims he never went, but his boots were seen, covered in ash, at 10, and he possessed the chapel key. Wimsey pulled the old iron thing from his pocket, which makes one wonder why Fenlo had to pry up the floor with a chisel rather than simply unlock the door. Parker frowned. You think Lyle gave him the key and regretted it? Or that Fenlo stole it? But the crucial question, Charles, is this. What happened between 10:30 and noon? Wimsey opened the drawing-room door and walked slowly through the space, pausing before the French windows. The garden was empty now, but the lines of sight were clear. From the gardener's shed, he said, you can see this window. We know someone was watching, likely Everley, but he saw no one enter. And yet Fenlo ends up dead, in a room no one saw him enter by means no one heard. Parker was silent a moment. Then he was killed elsewhere. Or he was already here. Wimsey turned, eyes alight. Elsie hears a cough at 10:30. But what if that wasn't Fenlo entering the library? What if it was someone leaving and shutting the library door behind them? And Fenlo? Already dead in the drawing-room. But wouldn't Miss Blount Simons have... She was in her study. The room opposite, down the corridor, the door closed. And the fire, not yet lit, that comes later. Hichu strode to the hearth again and knelt, brushing the ashes aside. Someone stabbed him here, Charles, with this. He retrieved the ivory-handled dagger from his coat and held it like a stage prop. It was hidden in the fireplace cavity, Parker said, by the killer, almost certainly, not hastily discarded, but concealed. Someone who knew the house, who knew the fireplace well enough to use it as a hiding place. Parker shook his head. That could still be Cordelia. Wimsey smiled. It could. But the dagger, Charles, the dagger belongs to the chapel. It was one of the ceremonial pieces, used in its dedication rites. And the person who helped preserve that chapel, who knew every artifact and document inside, was the Reverend Lyle. Parker looked up sharply. You think he killed Fenlo? I think, said Wimsey, that Fenlo told him about the will, about the transfer in 1889, about the letters. I think Lyle feared the scandal it would bring to the church, to his family perhaps. His father signed the record, and I think he came here that morning to talk sense into Fenlo, and when that failed, he silenced him. And then, Wimsey finished, he cleaned the hearth, relit the fire to obscure the smell, and burned the letter Fenlo had written him the day before. There was a long pause. Parker said, "You'll need to confront him." "Yes," said Wimsey, "but not yet." He stepped to the bell-pull and rang for Miss Blount-Simons. She arrived after a moment, pale and tightly composed. "You have news?" she asked. "I have need," said Wimsey, "of your assistance. We're staging a small theatrical scene. Tonight, just after dusk, in the chapel." She stiffened. "The chapel?" He smiled faintly. "I believe your uncle would have approved." That evening, the chapel was lit with flickering lanterns and pewter candlesticks borrowed from the dining room. The air was cold and heavy with expectation. At precisely 7 o'clock, the Reverend Lyle arrived, summoned under the pretext of a private vigil for the late Mr. Fenlow. He entered to find Wimsey standing alone at the altar, the leather pouch resting atop the cold stone. "I've found your father's signature," Wimsey said quietly, "and the dagger." Lyle looked at the pouch. He made no move. "Fenlow came to you," Wimsey said. "He told you what he found. You tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't back down." Lyle's expression didn't change, but a tremor passed through one hand. "You killed him to protect the church," Wimsey continued. "To protect your father. But you made a mistake. You used the dagger. You hid it in the only place you knew well enough to trust, the fireplace." Ilsh in silence, Wimsey turned and walked toward him, soft-footed like a priest himself. "I understand your reasons," he said, "but understand this. Fenlow died believing he was doing the right thing, and you set fire to a corpse to preserve a reputation. Which one of you acted more in faith? That broke him." Lyle staggered backward, and the pouch fell from his hands. "I didn't mean to—" he began. "He threatened to publish everything. The scandal would have—" "Would have what?" said Wimsey quietly. "Cleansed the record." Outside footsteps approached. Parker entered solemn. Lyle turned himself over without a word. Later, as they left the chapel, Parker said, "I almost feel sorry for him." "So do I," said Wimsey. "But I feel sorrier for Fenlow. He saw the truth and tried to keep it from burning, and behind them the chapel door shut with a soft final sound, like the closing of a book no one would ever read again." The following morning dawned with a pale, diluted sun that seemed almost embarrassed to show itself over Blackthorpe Hollow. The clouds had retreated to the hills, leaving the estate swaddled in a thin mist that clung to the hedgerows and curled in the corners of windows. It was the kind of day that seemed to ask for conclusions, quietly, without fanfare. Lord Peter Wimsey breakfasted alone, as was his custom after a solved mystery. He took 2 boiled eggs, precisely 5½ minutes, a pot of very black coffee, and the Wiltshire Chronicle, which had not yet caught wind of any ecclesiastical confessions. He read the obituaries with faint interest and was folding the paper just so when Parker entered, looking as though he'd slept in his collar. "They've taken him," Parker said, dispensing with pleasantries. Lyle made a full statement, claims he acted in desperation, regrets it, of course, talks a great deal about duty. Wimsey dipped his toast into the yolk. "Yes, it's always duty with men like him, never emotion, never impulse. A tidy name for personal terror. And Miss Blount-Simons. She stayed out of it. Lyle claims she didn't know what he'd done. Says she warned Fenlo the will would be contested, but that's all." "A convenient ignorance," Wimsey murmured, "but perhaps not a dishonest one. She has the sort of character that assumes the unpleasant will resolve itself if one closes enough doors." Parker poured himself a cup of coffee. "The local constabulary wants to call it done. Lyle's confession is thorough. Motive, means, opportunity, all ticked." "And yet," said Wimsey, chewing reflectively, "there's a ghost in the corner." Parker stared. "You think someone else was involved? Not in the killing, but in the aftermath." He rose, brushing crumbs from his trousers. "Something about that fire still bothers me. The timing, the choreography. But we accounted for that. Lyle lit it to obscure the evidence." Did he? Then why relight it at noon, when Cordelia would be certain to enter the room and discover the body? Why not leave the body there cold, unburnt? Why stage it at all unless he wanted it found? "Precisely," Wimsey said, reaching for his coat. "And the only person who benefits from the fire being discovered at noon is Miss Blount Simons." Parker blinked. "So she was involved." "Or," Wimsey said, "she knew enough not to ask questions. I think she entered that room knowing what she would find, and made sure the discovery occurred at a time that served her interests. Let's pay her one more visit." They found her in the conservatory, deadheading camellias with quiet violence. Her expression, when she saw them, was neither surprised nor particularly pleased. "Lord Peter." "Inspector, if you've come to talk of sin and absolution, I'm afraid you're a day late. The Reverend has already been carted off in the back of a police car." Wimsey smiled, a thin and surgical thing. "We came to talk of timing, Miss Blount Simons. Specifically, your recollection of events between 10 and noon on Thursday." She straightened. "I told you, I was in my study." "Yes," Wimsey said gently, "but not, I suspect, alone." She hesitated. "Who told you that?" "No one, but I find it improbable that a woman of your routine, so precise, so particular, would fail to notice a man being stabbed to death in her drawing-room, unless she had reason not to." Her silence was almost regal. "I believe," he continued, "that you heard something, perhaps even saw something, and rather than act, you waited. You gave Lyle time to hide the evidence, and then, at noon, you entered the room, lit the fire again, and discovered the body." "I didn't kill him," she said sharply. "No," said Wimsey, "but you let him die." There was a long, cold pause, the kind of silence where decisions are made. "He was going to ruin everything," she said at last. "The chapel would have been deconsecrated, the grounds turned over to a preservation society, my home, my inheritance, strangled in committee paperwork and heritage funds. I told Lyle to talk him down. I never meant for... But when it happened, you recognized the opportunity." She met his gaze. "I didn't relight the fire." "No?" Wimsey asked mildly. "Then who did?" The parrot chose that moment to squawk from the far side of the conservatory. "Liar!" it shrieked. "Fire! Fire! Liar!" Parker started. Wimsey merely turned his head, listening. "Seems your parrot has a flair for drama," he said. Cordelia smiled faintly. "He was my uncle's. Picked up more gossip than I ever could." "Indeed," Wimsey said. "Which brings me to the final matter. The bell." "The front bell?" "Yes. Elsie reported it rang on Wednesday afternoon. No one was at the door. She thought it might have been the wind. Probably was. Wimsey studied her, but it wasn't the wind. It was Fenlo. He rang the bell, saw someone, you perhaps, watching from the upstairs window, and waited. When no one came, he walked round the side and entered through the French doors. Her lips tightened. He didn't trust you. Not entirely. He knew he'd stirred something. That's why he wrote the line in his notebook. The bell tolled once, but no one came. A man waiting to be betrayed. Her voice was brittle, and yet he came inside. Because he believed in reason. Poor devil. There was no response. At last Wimsey bowed faintly. Miss Blount-Simons, you've committed no crime, but you've inherited something rather colder than the house. She looked at him. Are you threatening me? No, he said lightly, merely commenting. I find it's more effective. They left her there, amid the camellias and silence, the parrot muttering, liar, liar, in the background like a Greek chorus. Outside the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the chapel tower in the distance. Wimsey paused on the drive. Do you know what's most interesting, Charles? He asked. What's that? She could have stopped it. At any point. She could have walked into the drawing room at 10:30 and called for help. Could have told the truth about Lyle. Could have buried the past honestly. But she didn't. No, she waited. And in waiting, she made herself a part of it. Parker glanced at him. What now? Wimsey looked up at the clearing sky. Now we go home. Leave her to the house, the fire, and the ghost of Eustace Fenlo. He smiled faintly. After all, it was his fireplace. And with that, they stepped into the waiting car, the engine starting with a purr. Behind them, the house stood still, composed, unbothered, its hearth once again cold, and its secrets folded neatly behind the parlour curtains. They had left Blackthorpe Hollow behind them, but the ghost of its peculiar symmetry lingered. A Mandees in a fire that burns too late. A will hides in a chapel under stone. A vicar prays while concealing blood. And the woman who owns it all waters her camellias with a kind of horticultural ruthlessness. Yet Lord Peter Wimsey was not, as he might have been, resting in his London flat with Bach on the gramophone and a glass of Amontillado at hand. Instead, he and Inspector Parker found themselves in the Wiltshire Records Office, seated at a large oak table beneath the despondent gaze of Queen Victoria, whose portrait hung with the glum pride of a woman resigned to oversight. I thought we were finished, Parker said, fingers tapping idly on a thick index catalogue. Lyle confessed. Cordelia, whatever her moral complicity, committed no legal crime. The case is shut. Even the parrot's gone silent. Ah, but there's a question still scratching at the door, Wimsey murmured. I want to know what happened in 1889. Parker sighed. We already have the ledger from the chapel. An entry. Transfer of remains, unofficial. Witness, O. Lyle Sr. That's more than most get from a century-old parish. Yes, but who was moved and why? That's what nags. It was important enough to hide beneath stone, and important enough for a man to die over. That, Charles, is the kind of historical itch that demands scratching. The clerk, a wan young man with a clerical air and hair that resembled a pigeon's nest, returned with a shallow archive box labelled Blount-Simons' estate. Ecclesiastical. Holdings, 1870 to 1900. He placed it before them with a flourish of boredom. Wimsey, delicate as a surgeon, began leafing through the yellowed papers. Most were unremarkable. Receipts for altar linens, minutes from vestry meetings, a furious letter from a bishop objecting to the installation of a new brass lamp. It encourages modernism and possibly socialism, he had written with considerable vehemence. But it was Parker who found the relevant sheet, tucked at the bottom of a folder labelled Special Permissions. Bishop's authority required. He read aloud, "Petition to transfer remains from the family vault to the private chapel on the estate of Algernon Blount Simons, due to psychological distress experienced by the household and spiritual significance attached to the new site. Signed, Osric Lyle Sr., parish priest. Dated July 1889. Spiritual significance, Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. That's vicar speak, for the family were seeing ghosts. Parker set the paper down. So someone's bones were moved. Big deal. From the family vault. That means a Blount Simons. Question is, which one? They returned to the documents. Another record, more brittle than the rest, revealed the answer. A death certificate. Name, Letitia Blount Simons. Age, 19. Cause of death, consumption. Date, June 1889. Underneath, in smaller handwriting, a line had been added. Body relocated by family request. Interment now recorded at estate chapel. Consumption, Parker said. Nothing suspicious there. Wimsey's eyes were narrowed. No, but Letitia Blount Simons was unmarried, died young, and her name was struck from the family genealogy. That's not normal. He leaned back. Cordelia mentioned her uncle was fastidious about keeping the family record clean. I imagine that included inconvenient cousins. Parker made a face. So they buried a girl in the family chapel and erased her existence. Why? Wimsey gave him a sharp look. Because someone loved her. He rose slowly, drawing together the threads. Lyle's father performed the transfer. The chapel was altered to accommodate her body, perhaps even designed for it. Her name never spoken again. And yet the shame lingered. A century later, Fenlo finds the ledger and the letters. He realizes what happened, perhaps even finds Letitia's name in the chapel records, and begins to piece together the forgotten scandal. A pregnancy, maybe, or an affair with someone unseemly. Something buried and worth killing to keep that way. But that wouldn't explain Lyle's reaction, Parker said. He wouldn't kill over a love affair in 1889. No, but he'd kill to protect the reputation of the church. And of his father. The elder Lyle was involved in the cover-up. If Fenlo made that public, if he tied it to the revised will, the inheritance clause, the preservation trust, it wouldn't just expose Miss Blount Simons. It would discredit a line of clergy. Parker whistled softly. So that's the real fear, not the crime, but the continuity of deception. Exactly, Wimsey said. It's never the first lie that brings the house down. It's the 100 after, trying to keep it standing. They packed the papers, returned the box, and walked out into the chilly afternoon. The fog had returned, as if to draw a veil over the past now that it had been properly aired. Wimsey seemed quieter as they drove, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Do you ever wonder, Charles," he said at last, If some crimes are born simply of the unbearable knowledge that the truth will not fit the world we have made. Parker glanced at him. You mean Lyle? Yes. He wasn't defending murder. He was defending an illusion. His father, the sanctity of the chapel, the integrity of the estate, all those brittle, inherited lies, polished until they shine, hardly justifies stabbing a poet in the ribs. Indeed not, but it explains why Fenlo had to be stopped. Because he saw, and once you see the flaw in the glass, you can't unsee it. Back in London, Wimsey entered his flat with the slow, deliberate steps of a man returning from a long performance. Bunter, his imperturbable valet, greeted him with a discreet nod, and the unmistakable scent of roast duck wafting from the kitchen. Did we find the truth, my lord? He asked with the tone of someone who already knew the answer. We found it, Wimsey said, unbuttoning his coat. Rather a dusty sort, buried in bad Latin and worse intentions. And justice, my lord? Wimsey poured himself a brandy and stood by the fire. Justice is a matter for courts, he said. We merely discovered the remains. He sipped. Still, I do rather think the fireplace lit at noon was the kindest part of it all. Gave Fenlo the final word, in a manner of speaking. He gazed into the flames, eyes reflecting the flicker. Letitia, Lyle, Fenlo, Cordelia, all of them trying to arrange the past into something bearable. But it never fits, does it? You can move the body, hide the letter, alter the will, and still it burns. And then, almost gently, he added, Ashes never lie, Bunter. It's the living who do that. And with that, he raised his glass to the fireplace that lit at noon. The fire crackled softly in reply. The following week brought a subtle shift in the weather, and an even subtler one in the newspapers. Nestled somewhere between a piece on rural railway closures and a column on marmalade exports was a short, discreet article in the Times. Vicar resigns amid controversy. The Reverend Osric Lyle, vicar of Blackthorpe Hollow, has tendered his resignation following personal circumstances and has withdrawn from public duties. Diocesan officials declined to comment. No charges have been brought. A representative for the Blount-Simons estate has indicated that the matter is closed to the satisfaction of all parties involved. No mention of murder. No mention of a body found scorched beside a hearth, or of a will hidden beneath consecrated stone. And certainly no mention of the long-dead Letitia Blount-Simons, or the chapel floor under which her name had been hidden for more than a century. Lord Peter Wimsey read it over toast and Seville marmalade, offered a dry snort, and flipped to the chess column. Bunter, bringing in a fresh pot of coffee, glanced discreetly at the open page. No official consequences then, my lord? None whatsoever, said Wimsey. The Church closes its wounds with remarkable efficiency, stitches them with doctrine, and forgets where the scar was. And Miss Blount-Simons? Wimsey reached for the envelope lying beside his breakfast plate. It had arrived that morning, written in a firm but elegant hand on heavy paper. He unfolded the letter and read silently for a moment. She writes, he said at last, that she intends to convert the chapel into a museum space. Private appointments only. She also encloses a donation to the Wiltshire Historical Trust. Substantial. Bunter raised an eyebrow, but as always did not comment. She thanks me, Wimsey added, for preventing unnecessary spectacle. Rather charming of her. "I expect the parrot remains unimpressed," said Bunter, pouring the coffee. Wimsey smiled. "Liar, liar, liar! Yes, I imagined so." He took a sip and leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "You know, Bunter, I do not believe Cordelia grieved Fenlo at all. Not even in the way one grieves a troublesome relative or an inconvenient house-guest. But she respected him in the end. He forced her to acknowledge what the rest of her life was built upon, and once she saw it, once the illusion cracked, she did not try to restore it. She simply arranged the ruins more tastefully." "A curious kind of redemption, my lord, quite, though not unfamiliar in England." That afternoon, an envelope arrived from the diocesan archive. Wimsey had made a quiet request the previous week, one that had been passed between clerks and secretaries, and ultimately approved with the sort of ecclesiastical reluctance usually reserved for minor exorcisms. Inside were 6 pages of transcribed correspondence between the Reverend Osric Lyle Sr. and Algernon Blount Simons, dated from the spring and summer of 1889. Wimsey read them in silence. Her condition, both spiritual and physical, continues to decline. She remains adamant that she wishes no public funeral. I have done as you requested, and informed the bishop that the chapel is being prepared. The new vault beneath the altar should be complete within the fortnight. Another page, dated 3 weeks later. The girl is dead. The shame, I fear, will be buried with her. There is no longer any appetite in the house for confession. We shall record only what is necessary to preserve the dignity of the family." Wimsey stared at that line for a long while. Parker arrived shortly after tea. "She's given the land to the Preservation Society," he said without preamble. "The entire west garden, including the chapel." Wimsey blinked. "Is she? Some kind of long-term lease arrangement. Public access twice a year. Quietly negotiated, of course. No announcements." "Well," said Wimsey slowly, "that is both fitting and extraordinary." He stood and walked toward the window, where the early twilight was beginning to settle over Piccadilly. "It's a strange justice, Charles. Fenlo didn't get his scandal, but he got his legacy." Parker joined him at the window. "What happens now?" "Now?" Wimsey said. "The past rests, for now. The chapel will be catalogued, the bones beneath it labelled. The family line will remain pruned where it always was. But the truth exists, Charles. It lives." He turned to his friend. "That's all one can ask in the end. Not that the truth triumph, but that it endure." There was a pause. Then Parker said, "Do you believe she knew about Letitia? Before Fenlo told her?" "No," said Wimsey. "But I think she suspected, and did everything she could not to know." They stood in silence for a moment more, then returned to their chairs. "I wonder," Parker said idly, "what Fenlo meant by the line. Even in silence, the house listens." Wimsey smiled faintly. "I imagine he meant exactly what it said. Some houses remember things. They retain them, in walls, in dust, in fire. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, they murmur back. Poetic nonsense." "Yes," said Wimsey, "but isn't that what truth often is?" Later that night, alone again, Wimsey sat before his fireplace and stirred the embers. They crackled softly, but offered no revelations. Still, he found comfort in the ritual. He'd always trusted fire. It revealed things in its way, not with logic or chronology, but with ashes and heat. He looked down at the hearth and murmured more to himself than to Bunter, who was polishing glassware in. "The next room, it's the cold fires that are dangerous. The ones no one watches. The ones that light themselves." There was no reply, just the sound of the city beyond the window, and the fire breathing quietly at his feet. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and thought of Fenlo. Quiet, fastidious, precise in his obscure scholarship, and burned for what he'd uncovered. Not a martyr, perhaps, but something close. A man who'd believed that the dead had rights too. And across the countryside, in a chapel now empty and silent, a stone slab rested a little easier. Its secrets known, its occupant remembered. Not with ceremony, perhaps, but with truth. The fireplace had lit at noon, and that had been enough. 2 months passed. Winter crept into Wiltshire with its usual subtlety, first through the hedgerows, where the last stubborn leaves blackened like burnt paper, then into the hallways of country homes, where the air took on the scent of coal smoke and ancient linen. Blackthorpe Hollow did not change much with the season. It had the air of a place that did not acknowledge time so much as accommodate it. Even murder here had come and gone like a particularly unpleasant storm, disruptive, but not defining. The chapel stood quiet now, padlocked except on certain marked days, when a discreet placard on the garden gate announced that it was open by appointment, Blackthorpe Historical Collection. There was no fanfare, no brochures, just a list of objects, 3 pews, an iron cross, the ceremonial dagger now cleaned and reframed, and 1 headstone beneath the floor, finally marked Letitia Blount Simons, 1870-1889 she lived. No other epitaph had been permitted. Cordelia, when approached by the trust for a more poetic tribute, had demurred. Truth, she'd said, plain and sufficient. She lived. That was all Fenlo had wanted the world to know. Lord Peter Wimsey returned to Blackthorpe on a sharp day in early December, his purpose not investigative but sentimental. The Historical Trust had asked him to attend a small, private dedication of the restored chapel space, which he suspected was as much about optics as gratitude. Still, he had accepted the invitation without hesitation, and arrived with only his walking stick and a copy of the collected works of Lionel Strongarm under his arm, dog-eared at the corners. He was met at the gate by Cordelia Blount Simons, bundled in a dark wool coat, her hair pinned severely beneath a black velvet hat. She looked thinner, not broken, but honed, like glass cut to a finer shape. "Peter," she said. "You came, you asked," he replied, "and I confess I'm curious to see if the ghosts are feeling sociable." She offered a wan smile, and led him through the garden, now rimed with frost. They said little until they reached the chapel. Inside, it had been scrubbed clean, almost too clean. The mildew had been vanquished, the brass polished to within an inch of its life. The altar was bare, save for a single white lily and a small plaque bearing a brief dedication to those whose histories were not told. Wimsey stepped slowly down the centre aisle. "It's rather antiseptic, isn't it?" he murmured. "Like a museum exhibit of belief." "I thought it best," Cordelia said quietly. "No reverence, no incense, just facts." He nodded, and yet I can still hear him. Fenlo? Yes, muttering to himself about architectural irregularities and theological metaphors. A scholar to the end. Died for his footnotes. She winced. I meant no cruelty, Wimsey said gently. He was a good man. He annoyed you. That's often the mark of a good man. She walked to the plaque and touched it lightly with her glove. Didn't know about Letitia, she said. I thought I knew everything about this place. I thought it belonged to me. He watched her carefully. And now I know I was just the last one holding the keys. She turned. The house, the chapel, the inheritance, it was all founded on a kind of silence, a beautiful, airtight silence. And I thought preserving it meant preserving us. And now you've allowed it to be heard. She smiled faintly. A little. There was a moment of peace between them. Then she said, I still don't sleep well. Guilt? No, she said. Recognition. Wimsey nodded. Those are the ones that keep you up. Not the wrongs you commit, but the truths you finally understand. She turned to him. Do you think I'm a bad person? I think you're an English person, he said lightly, which is much the same thing. She laughed once, sharp and surprised. Thank you, she said. I do try. As they walked back to the house, Cordelia paused by a shrub that had once been Letitia's, now marked with a small copper tag. Blount Simon's Camellia. Var Letitia. Will you stay the night? She asked. There's a room ready. Not the one where Fenlo stayed. No, he said gently. I don't think I'd sleep well either. She nodded. Then at least stay for tea. He did. They took it in the drawing room. The same room, though now stripped of its drama. The fire was burning, politely this time, with no hint of performance. The chairs had been rearranged, the rug replaced. The scorched mark where Fenlo had died had been professionally removed, though Wimsey could still sense the exact square foot of carpet just beneath the armchair, the way one always senses a missing tooth with the tongue. They talked of practical things, the trust, the chapel ledger, a new garden path to be installed. Not once did they mention the word murder. It seemed unnecessary. As the light faded, Wimsey stood. I'll walk to the station, he said. The air's bracing. Cordelia did not argue. She merely watched him go. Standing at the threshold like a woman seeing off a storm, she no longer feared. The path back to the station wound past the gardener's shed, now boarded up, and past the Folly, half collapsed under its own aesthetic weight. Wimsey paused briefly there, hand on the gate, and looked back at the manor. Somewhere inside, Cordelia would be closing shutters against the cold. Somewhere underneath, Letitia would be silent no longer. And somewhere, perhaps in a library, not unlike his own, someone would one day read Fenlo's notes and understand that a man's legacy was not always bound in books, but sometimes in stubbornness, in inconvenient questions, in the courage to ask what lies beneath a chapel floor. The train came just after dusk. Wimsey boarded with a faint smile, settled into the compartment, and watched the countryside dissolve into shadow. As the lights flickered on, he took from his coat a thin sheaf of pages, the last poem Fenlo had ever written, found in his satchel, never published. Wimsey read the first lines aloud, softly. There is a fire that waits behind the stone, a warmth unbidden, ghosted by design. It speaks in ash, and when the house is gone, its breath remains steady beneath the spine. He folded the paper gently and slid it into his pocket. Outside, the landscape rolled by, quiet, dark, remembering. And behind him, in Blackthorpe Hollow, the fire slept. The final reveal came not with a bang, but with a correction. It was 10 days after Wimsey's return to London, and he had all but folded the case into his mind's archives, carefully labelled and alphabetized under F for fireplaces, falsehoods, and Fenlo, Eustace, deceased, when an envelope arrived with no return address. The paper was thick, the script angular and precise. Inside was a single sentence. You were wrong about one thing. No signature, no elaboration, no return address. And yet Wimsey, who had once dated a viscountess solely to retrieve a disputed first edition of Donne, knew immediately who had sent it, Miss Cordelia Blount Simons. The letter was not indignant, not defensive, merely declarative, and it had the desired effect. Wimsey read it 3 times before placing it in the fire, where it curled and blackened with a satisfying hiss. He then rang for Bunter. Have my coat pressed. We're going back to Blackthorpe. The house was exactly as it had been, austere, commanding, quietly resentful of visitors. Cordelia received him with the calm of a woman who had not slept well, but had made peace with it. You received my note, she said. I did, Wimsey replied, removing his gloves with theatrical precision. You claim I was wrong. You'll forgive me for needing that clarified. She gestured toward the drawing-room, which no longer looked like the scene of a death, but the setting of an agreeable Sunday book club. They did not sit. I didn't relight the fire, she said quietly. Not at noon, not at all. Wimsey tilted his head. We've been over this. You assumed I lit it, that I staged the scene. But I didn't. Then who did? Her lips pressed together. I think, she said slowly. He did. Wimsey blinked. Fenlo? She nodded once. I went into the drawing-room just before 10. He was seated by the hearth, alive, pale, shaken. He said, It's done. I didn't know what he meant. I asked if he'd spoken to the vicar. He shook his head and handed me a folded letter. She walked to the cabinet and withdrew it. I never opened it. I couldn't. I kept it all this time. I don't know why. Wimsey took the envelope. It was addressed in Fenlo's hand. To those who survived me. No date, no seal. He broke it gently and read, I have seen the truth, and I cannot hold it. I thought I could make it known. But there is no justice that does not devour the innocent with the guilty. Cordelia knows nothing. The vicar fears too much. I have removed the evidence. The documents are destroyed. I will not be used as a weapon. I return myself to the fire. Wimsey stood in silence. He meant to die, Cordelia whispered. He built the fire himself, lit it, sat there and waited. I left the room. I didn't believe him. I thought it was more of his melodrama. When I came back, her voice cracked once, and she did not finish. Wimsey folded the letter. You could have told us. I tried, but once everyone wanted it to be murder, it became easier to let them believe it. And the dagger. She hesitated. That I don't know. I thought Lyle had done it. Wimsey said nothing for a moment. Fenlo stabbed himself, he said at last, the weight of it settling over them both. A controlled wound, enough to bleed but not to kill outright. He wanted the fire to do that. She nodded, pale. The coroner said the burns were inconsistent, but they never pressed it. "He created the scene himself," Wimsey murmured. "Lit the fire, arranged the books, left the message in his notebook. He was the performance." Cordelia looked at him. "Why?" Wimsey stared at the hearth. "Because he believed the truth mattered more than his life, but not more than yours or Lyle's. So he erased himself, gave us the puzzle, and hoped we'd stop before solving it completely." "And you didn't?" "No." He looked down at the letter again. "But perhaps we've understood it now." Later that evening, in the fading light, Wimsey stood once more before the chapel. The west garden was empty. The camellias had gone to seed. The plaque still shone in the cold air. He opened the door, stepped inside, and placed Fenlow's letter in a small iron dish beside the altar. A match flared. The paper curled and vanished into ash. No one would read it again. No record would remain. But the truth had been spoken, not in a courtroom, not in headlines, just between those who had carried its burden. Wimsey turned back to the doorway, looked once more upon the quiet pews, the cold stone, the dark vaults below, and then he said very softly, almost to himself, "Some fires do light themselves, but only when someone's watching." And with that, he stepped into the evening, the chapel door closing quietly behind him for the last time.